Hi everyone, it's been a long time since I posted the last video, almost, over a year ago, and that was the Conan video for the omnibus. Today I'd like to do a video on a couple of books that I recently picked up, and they all are the same subject matter. Fantastic Four #1. And the books I'm talking about today are Fantastic Four panel by panel, and Maximum FF #1. Now, both those books are very similar. They both basically take Fantastic Four #1 and do a deep study of each panel of the book. What I mean by that is they actually zoom in very close and show you the detail of the artwork that was done, and go over, and basically just show you each panel one by one throughout the entire FF #1. Now, they both do very different approaches, but let's talk about the first time I ran into Fantastic Four #1, which is the origin of the Fantastic Four. The first time I ever came across the origin of the Fantastic Four was in this magazine right here, Dynamite number 9, which Dynamite Magazine was a magazine for kids, printed from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, and basically in our classroom when I was in, I think it was 5th grade, you could write up for a subscription right from the classroom. I mean, your teacher would hand out these subscriptions, you would go home, get a check from mom or dad, and then submit that, and they would deliver the magazines in class. So basically once a month, the teacher would come along and pass out your Dynamite magazine. And I love this magazine because it was geared towards kids. It was very pop culture. This one has an article on John Denver, but at the time it could be on an album that was released or a very popular TV show. But the one thing they had in every issue, and I think it wasn't in #1, could have been, they had a section called Superhero Confidential. Which Superhero Confidential, what that was it was a 2-page reprint of Silver and Golden Age superheroes' origins. And I believe, of course, the first one that was in the magazine was Superman's origin from Action Comics #1, which was a 2-pager origin. And then the origin from the second issue was Batman, origin story from Batman #1, which again was another 2-page origin. But at some point, they were reprinting 2-page origins for origin stories that kind of spanned larger number of pages. And what they would do then is they would edit them down condensely. For example, on this one right here for the Fantastic Four, they basically they give a synopsis about the rocket landing, but then they go right to the panel after post-rocket landing, and then only give right up to the end where they all join hands and they agree to become a team. And that was the first time I ever ran into it. Also, this book came with a poster, which that's long gone, a poster of the Fantastic Four, and I think that was done by John Buscema, possibly, and then inked by Joe Sinnott, who was a avid Fantastic Four inker for years and years and years. Now, that's the very first time I ran across the edited version of the origin. But I want to point out, in this origin story that was reprinted in the 70s, that they are all wearing purple jumpsuits, because Marvel at some point went back when they would reprint the origin stories. They would make corrections and changes to them, because in the early editing days there were some mistakes, and they would go back and correct those mistakes. But they also a lot of times did recoloring. And in the original origin that was printed in the Fantastic Four #1, they all wore blue jumpsuits. And then sometime in the 70s, and I think it was when this book was published, which is a bunch of collections of Marvel origin stories that were actually published by a book publisher in the 1970s. When this book was published, Marvel would go back and recolor all the origins and make corrections to them, fixing some of the past mistakes. And that's when they did the purple jumpsuits, and that kind of stuck with it for the longest time. I know by the mid 90s or late 80s, when the very first Marvel Masterworks came out for Fantastic Four, it still had the color changes that they had introduced in the 70s. Now when you pick up an omnibus or a masterwork, it has the original color of the original issue of the books. Now, so I first saw the origins in Dynamite. They had the purple jumpsuit, but then I saw a complete version of the origin in the mass market paperbacks that Marvel published during the 70s. They were called pocketbooks, and they basically had like 5 or 6 issues of the book in a mass market pocketbook size. So it was little books like this. I'll show you a picture. And at that time, we saw the purple jumpsuits. And again, that was so prolific that even when John Byrne did his retelling of the origin within the pages of Fantastic Four, and also his version in What If, he used the purple jumpsuits as well. Now, the first time I saw the full origin was actually in this. Fantastic Four: The Way It Began, which was basically a book and record set that Marvel released through Power Records during the 70s. And DC and Marvel had a whole bunch of these things. And I still have a couple from when I was a kid. They were lots of fun. You put on the record, 45 record, you play it, and it would basically read a edited version of an original Marvel comic. This, I believe, was Fantastic Four 126, and it was a retelling of the Fantastic Four origin. And again, in this retelling, they went back to the blue jumpsuits for the 70s. But what we're here to talk about is, Fantastic Four #1, which was an important book for Marvel Comics, which wasn't even known as Marvel Comics. It was still, I think, Atlas at the time, where they were just making the transition. It came out in 1961. Prior to that, Marvel was doing all the monster books. I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with this. I was not when I was a kid. I had no clue that, because, I was born in 64. Fantastic Four came out in 61. So by the time I started collecting comics, they were a super hero comic book company. But prior to 61, or right up until 61, they were producing giant monster books, what we would call kaiju nowadays. But they were producing monster books and suspense books. Basically, Steve Ditko was working on the suspense books. Jack Kirby was working on the monster books. The stories would kind of overlay in an issue of like Journey into Mystery would have some monster stories and some thriller stories. And Don Heck was working on these books as well. But, it was time, I guess they were reducing some of the publishing at the time. They weren't sure if they were going to move forward with the comic line. And basically the publisher knew about the existence of the Justice League and asked Stan Lee to come up with a concept for a team book. Well, Stan Lee went and he created a new team because they had no superhero staples at the time. So they created this team of 4 heroes when we all know the Fantastic Four. But he collaborated on this effort with Jack Kirby. You all should know Jack Kirby. Please tell me you know Jack Kirby. I ran into someone at the comic store like a couple months ago, and they had no clue who Jack Kirby was. Just the co-inventor and almost the inventor of Marvel Comics. But he worked very closely with Jack Kirby. In fact, it's very muddled who came up with what concepts. Jack was an idea man. Stan was a marketing man. He was a great base writer as far as writing dialogue. He's really great at dialogue. Jack Kirby was an idea man, not as so great at dialogue, but that's what made them a great team when they worked together. Was Jack would have all these amazing ideas and do these dynamic illustrations, and Jack Kirby would come and pitch his story outline sometimes, and then come in and do his dialogue and pump up the story, make it so important and dramatic. And they were just a winning team during the 1960s. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, they made Marvel Comics together. Jack Kirby does not get enough credit for his contribution to Marvel Comics. Now, again, let's go back to Fantastic Four #1. They're taking a risk. They're making something different. They're creating a team book when they had no heroes to make a team book. So they make something original, something very spectacular at the time, because they weren't, DC was doing all of these heroes at the time still. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Flash, and Green Lantern were recently reintroduced about 5 or 6 years ago. And so they had all these heroes, but the heroes were very bland and generic. They all got along, and then you could throw one. They had no personality. Basically, it was just costume and powers, and they didn't have any differentiating personality. And that's what I think Stan Lee is probably the most important contribution to the Marvel age of comics. Was when he wrote the dialogue, he made sure to embed the heroes with personality. Again, I think Jack and Steve Ditko for Spider-Man, Peter Parker, they kind of drew and knew what they wanted, but it was Jack had to sell that with his dialogue, and that's his. Not Stan Lee had to sell that in his dialogue, and that's his contribution. I don't want to diminish it, but again, the artists don't get as much credit as they deserve for creating Marvel Comics. Now, I have an outline here, and I want to just go over a couple of differences between the two books. The Maximum FF came out a few years ago, and basically it is a reprint of Fantastic Four with enlarged panels. So they're really kind of just zooming in on the panels and giving you the story, piece by piece. And you do get the full story from the comic. And again, things like this. Yeah. And again, this came out as a novelty. And the cover, you can unfold the cover, and it basically is a giant poster of Fantastic Four #1 cover of the book. And there's a couple essays in here, one by Mark Evener, who is kind of like the unofficial historian of Jack Kirby, and, the writer of the book, Walter Mosley. He has a couple things to write. He talks about his first finding FF #1 and falling in love with Fantastic Four comics, and why he wanted to do such a book like this. And I think this is for a table, coffee table book. This is a nice book. It kind of really does illustrate, gives you nice large illustrations of Jack Kirby's work, and it's a decent book. The thing is, it's all large panels with a couple of essays, and so you have really no context of how the book was put together page by page. And they also took all digital scans, which is great because this is a nice, clean looking book. This is a great looking book. All the images are very white and pristine and crystal clear. But again, because the panels are blown up, there's no context of how they fit together or how Jack Kirby illustrated a page. Now that's the difference between this book. Now this book, Fantastic Four, panel by panel, is quite different. This book was done by Chip Kidd and Jeff Spears. Chip Kidd has a history of doing these kind of illustrated books, but what he likes to do is he likes to do raw scans. Basically, scan a book and present it down and dirty. For example, if you look at these panels, they're not as clean. They're not as pristine. You can actually see the printing points from the original books. And also, he scanned some of the ads as well that you were on the adjacent pages. And again, not as clean as the other one. This is kind of really, very, very raw compared to the other book. I mean, we have these panels that are, even has the double press that was common for comics at the time. Basically the coloring kind of bleeds over the actual black ink because the pressing wasn't always aligned correctly, which nowadays in digital form, that has been corrected many times over. And so you don't see that in modern comics. But basically, Chip Kidd took an old Fantastic Four and broke it down and scanned the pages. And again, this not as clean, but it's got this really cool aesthetic to it because you are looking at an original scan from an original book. But what this book also does is at the end here, Tom Brevoort, I think that's how you pronounce his name, does an essay. And this, funny enough, this book also has the exact same Mark Evener essay from the other book in this book. So Tom Brevoort did an essay, the writer does an essay, but then Tom Brevoort goes down and breaks down each page of the book. So you're not only getting the wide scans of the book, but you're also getting a breakdown of how the pages were assembled together. And at the very end of the book, you actually get a reprint or the entire scan of the Fantastic Four #1, ads and all. It's not the prettiest looking copy of Fantastic Four #1, but it's all there. So you get to see the original book as it was done. And I think if I was going to compare the two, I like both of them. But I think my preference is this one because, in this day and age, I have an omnibus that has Fantastic Four #1 printed on it. I have a digital copy of Fantastic Four #1. They're clean, they're pristine. Yes, they look great, and I can go to those anytime. But if I want to study the book as it was released in 1961, this is the one that's going to do it. This is the one that's going to give me something that this one won't. So if I have to make a recommendation, it would be the Fantastic Four #1 panel by panel by Chip Kidd and Jeff Spears. Again, this is an important book in Marvel history. Everyone should at least read this and know of its existence. I know in today's modern times, a lot of people don't know about the history of the comics. And again, I was so disappointed and surprised when someone in the comic store didn't know who Jack Kirby was. Everyone should know who Jack Kirby is. Everyone knows who Stan Lee is because Stan Lee was a great self-promoter. Jack Kirby kind of was, he did his job. He was a workman. He did his job. He illustrated tons and tons, hundreds and hundreds of books. And it'd be a shame if he was forgotten. In fact, I kind of made a decision. I think I'm going to start doing a lot more Jack Kirby content on this page just because everyone should know who Jack Kirby is. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video and I didn't go on too long on this one. Please like, subscribe, give me some comments. Let me know if you like this type of thing, if you want me to change something. Make a request. I'm a old guy, been around for a while, and there's probably a run or two that I have some personal experience with. And that's really what this channel is about. It's kind of my personal experience and my discoveries. And I hope that some of you people enjoy that and get something out of it. Please, thanks. I really appreciate your time.